Chapter 6, Critical Thinking and Reasoning. In this chapter, we're going to look at persuasion a little bit more and how to have logical arguments that you use within your persuasive presentations. We're going to touch a little bit on kind of the expectations for this course. We may not dig quite as deeply as the chapter does, but we'll look at kind of the basic information. So in chapter 6, we're going to start off by talking about critical thinking. So when you think about your persuasive presentations, and you know that in these presentations you need to convince your audience about something. You're trying to get them to support you, believe you, change a value, belief, or behavior, or to really reinforce a value, belief, or behavior. And in order to do that, you really need to make sure that you have valid support material that's supporting everything, and that your arguments that you use to support that information are well formed, and they're logical, and they make sense. So the first part of this is critical thinking. Critical thinking is active thinking in which we evaluate and analyze information in order to determine the best course of action. So when we are thinking critically, we are looking at all of our options, we're analyzing the information provided, and we're making sure that we have the most valid information, the most valid arguments to support what we're sharing. Barry Beyer stated that critical thinking means making reasoned judgments. So making your determinations through sound reasoning. We rationalize and justify our conclusions. So how did we get to where we ended up? And we question things along the way to make sure that what we're saying is valid, it makes sense. To an outside listener, it's going to make sense. To maybe someone that's uninformed, it's logical and it's easy to follow. So the skills involved in critical thinking are listening skills, analysis, evaluation, inference, interpretation, explanation, and self-regulation. So think about all of these things. Think about the process of when you're researching your presentations, when you're looking for information. Think about really listening, being an active listener, and listening to how the argument is formed, how the argument sounds, how it comes across. Analyze. Don't just take things at face value. Analyze the content of your material and evaluate that to say, okay, this may not be the best way to defend what I'm trying to say. Inferences. So a lot of times what we do is we gather support material, and based on the information provided, we can infer something else. So make sure that the support material that you have allows you to make good, solid inferences. Interpret the support material, interpret in the process of the speech development, but also make sure if you're providing information like studies, research in your presentation, that you do a good job of interpreting what it's saying. To conclude, this is what this body of research is telling you. Explain it clearly. Some things are harder to follow than others, so make sure that you have a clear explanations. And self-regulation. Sometimes if we're really passionate about something, it's easier for us to make information support exactly what we want it to say, because we want it to defend ourselves. We want to defend ourselves. We want it to say what we want to say. So just kind of have those check-ins to make sure, is this information really saying what I think it says, or do I just really want it to be saying that? So logic and the role of arguments. When we think and speak logically, we pull together statements that combine reasoning with evidence to support an assertion, which is also known as an argument. Logical arguments use evidence as anything used to support the validity of your assertion. So that's your expert testimony, scientific findings, statistics, sometimes physical objects. Think about logos, like we talked about Aristotle's 3 types of proofs. Logos are those logically sound arguments and evidence that supports what we're saying. Deductive reasoning is an argument in which the truth of its premises guarantees the truth of its conclusion. So based on this premise that I'm giving you, this is the only conclusion that we can make. Inductive reasoning is the fact alone does not make it the opposite of deductive reasoning. It's with the truth of its proposition lens to support the conclusion. So deductive is this premise leads to this conclusion. Inductive is this could possibly lead to the following conclusion. Understanding fallacies. So a lot of times in presentations, I'll hear flawed arguments. I'll hear fallacies within arguments. For instance, I was listening to a presentation this week, and it was why you should buy hybrid cars over or electric cars over gasoline, regular cars. And so one of the arguments is that it can be dangerous to go to gas pumps. If you have your car running when you get gas, that's dangerous. So I would call that a flawed argument on why you would get hybrid or electric cars. I would say for the most part, as long as we make good decisions when we're going to the gas station, that it's not a dangerous place typically. That's not to say that it couldn't be dangerous, but as long as we're not smoking while we get gas, we turn our car off like we're supposed to, as long as we're following basic rules that all of us have known since we're 16 at least, then I don't consider that to be a dangerous location. But that was one of her arguments on why she felt like a hybrid or electric car was safer than a regular car. So there's fallacies in arguments, but sometimes we make those, one, because we don't have enough information to support what we're trying to say, but two, sometimes we have fallacies in our arguments because we're reaching to draw conclusions with something, and there's just not enough out there to support us. Sometimes we just really want to draw those conclusions. The existence of a fallacy in a deductive argument makes the entire argument invalid. So anytime you have a flawed argument, you have an error in your reasoning, then that's going to make the entire argument invalid. So if you have one flawed argument in a 9-minute persuasive speech, think about the impact that can have in your impact as a speaker. The existence of a fallacy in an inductive argument weakens the argument, but does not necessarily invalidate it. So with a deductive argument, if you have a flawed reason, then the conclusion's out. With an inductive argument, if you have a flawed reason, it doesn't necessarily invalidate it, but it does weaken it. So formal fallacies. Formal fallacy is an error in the structure of the argument. So the premise of the argument is bad, and therefore the conclusion is bad. There's mass man fallacy, involves substitution of parties. So you intentionally are deceitful within your argument. And then there's fallacies of quantitative logic, which focuses on words like some or all. So sometimes when we're making an argument, we make very broad assertions, like all people that do this is what's going to happen. It's going to happen all of the time. So just kind of be careful with the way that you broadly assign an argument. So there's informal fallacies. An informal fallacy occurs because of an error in reasoning. So some of these things are, they're not on purpose necessarily. They may not necessarily be something you intended to do, but it weakens the appeal. And if you refer to your book, it's going to explain kind of all of these fallacies. I think the one that we see the most is the slippery slope fallacy. I think sometimes, other than a weak or a false analogy, a slippery slope is sometimes we make one assertion, which really kind of can take us down a slippery slope that moves far away from where we intended it to be. We can make broad generalizations about something that really there's no validity to say it would have that big of an impact. We just kind of make these broad assertions about it. For the purpose of our class, the main thing that I'm looking for is that the arguments that you use in your persuasive presentations are valid, that they're not far-reaching, that they make sense. So a big part of how you do that is that you research your topics. If you have a main point that you're not finding information to support, then the odds are that's not a very good main point. So, for instance, the hybrid car, electric car analogy, I would say that conclusion drawn by that student was not made by research. I would say that that was a point where she could not find the research that she wanted, so she made broad conclusions with no basis in fact. As long as the information that you're saying is based in fact, it's based in the research that you found, then it should be reasonable and not flawed. The important thing is that you do proper research. If you do not find the research to support your claim, then you reconsider your claim.